Hey, John here. I was handed a few swords to build a display for. These swords are awards given during bodybuilding competitions. I was handed 3 and asked to be creative. I played around with the layout until I found what I thought would be a neat display. So now that we know what this is going to look like in our heads, let's get cutting. The Katana sheath was really pretty, so I decided to include that in the box. The Spartan sword was a bit short, and I thought it would look awkward going in the same direction as the other longer swords, so I decided to place it vertical in the box. While figuring out the measurement for the box, I came up with the bright idea to place the Spartan sword through the box, so I did not have to make the box so big trying to fit it all inside. So at this point, I knew I wanted the box to be a little less than 48 inches wide. This would give plenty of room on each side of the largest sword, and my main concern was the wood being used. I used 4-foot birch backplates, and this would allow me to keep that to one piece. My first cut was based on the Spartan sword. The blade was 18 inches long, so I decided to make my racks 16 inches. This would allow the point of the Spartan sword to go through and the hilt to rest on top of the frame. The racks would fit tight between the top and bottom. Now let's design the rack. Once I had my 16-inch piece cut, I used it to get a feel for the layout. I placed all 3 items on the piece and spaced them out. Remember that the end of each side of the rack will be touching the top and bottom of the frame, so ensure your hilt is not above the end of the rack piece. Once I was pleased with the layout, I took a pencil and marked the locations of each item. Now extend your marks to the side of the board. This is where the swords will rest, so your design will be based off of these positions. The marks here will not change. With a protractor, I make some curves to the spots where the swords will rest. You can make this fancy or generic. You just need to leave a small lip in the front so the swords cannot fall forward. The katana sheath is a bit thicker than the swords, so I took another measurement to make sure the lip will be deep enough and the katana sheath can fit all the way inside the rack without extending beyond the lip. Then I grab a Sharpie and retrace my lines so I will have no problem seeing them when I go to cut them out. I take it to the bandsaw and cut out the ledges. If you don't have a bandsaw, this can be done with a jigsaw just as easy. Just don't forget to clamp down the piece when cutting so you don't risk it moving while you cut and you keep your lines straight. On the inside flats, don't try to make the cut by twisting your blade. Drill out the inside so you can maneuver your blade and get a crisp corner. With the drilled out holes, your pivots will be super easy to navigate and it will save you a lot of time in the long run. Before you move on, check your fit and ensure you don't have to make any adjustments. Now take your piece to the sanding wheel. You can use an orbital sander here just as well. You're basically trying to make sure that you have a nice smooth piece and that no ribbing from the bandsaw or the jigsaw is still visible. Here I took a small sanding wheel from my Dremel to get inside the small area that the larger sanders could not reach. My next step was to round the edges. Instead of using a detail sander, I just used a rounded router bit and ran both sides of the rack around the bit. This would make a small rounded edge on it that will be nice and even being the key. Sanding would have produced varying levels, and you don't want too much off. You just want to make the edge slightly rounded. I'm pretty sure I've showed you this trick before, but take a pair of calipers and get the width of your piece. Now grab your iPhone and divide that number in half. Yes, your phone has a calculator on it. Did I tell you I'm afraid of public math? Now divide that number in half and set your calipers to that number. Using the back side of your calipers, now you can set the fence on your bandsaw. With your fence locked in place, cut your piece in half. Use a feather board so you have no unnecessary movement. Now go back to the router table and round the edges of each side you just cut. Before the next step, go grab yourself some 320 sandpaper and give each side a good sanding. Once we place these pieces in their slots, they will be more difficult to sand, so let's knock that out right now. I did not want the base of the racks to be too big and distracting, so I put my rack on the piece and decided to reduce the base to 1.25 inches. This wouldn't be taking off much, but it would be just enough to make it less visible. Once I finished that cut, I cut the entire piece in half. I then took out my dado blades and stacked them up until I had a perfect match for the thickness of the rack. I raised my blade just a bit and cut at least halfway through the piece. I did not do any super math here trying to figure out the perfect center of the piece. I just eyeballed it. It's really not that important as long as you are close. Then you can check your fit and move on. I made the base piece a little bit longer, but now that you have the rack in the base, you can mark it and then cut it to the exact length. I took an extra step at this point because I still had not put away my router table, so I just rounded the edges the exact smoothness as the rack edges. Just a small extra finishing touch, probably no one will ever notice it. With your racks pretty much finished, you can glue them into the base. Once in place, take some clamps and clamp them down for a secure bond. After the glue has set, you can come back and stain your pieces. Nothing fancy here, just rub on the stain until you get the desired darkness you desire. Okay, the Spartan sword will be going through the box, so we need to make sure it clears the highest item, which happens to be the katana sheath. So I place a level on my blade and pretend that it is going through the box. This will give you your needed height for the frame of the box. You don't want your frame to be lower than the tip of the sword because it will not be going through the frame if you do it that way. Having decided that my width was going to be 2.5 inches, I set my fence to make my long 48-inch rips. Since the board is only 4 feet, I can assume that my back plate will fit inside the frame with just a little bit to spare once cut down. Knowing that my racks are 16 inches, the added frame on each side should equal 17.5 inches. I double checked this to ensure I am still on target with the Spartan sword being able to go all the way through the box. With that same measurement, I cut my pieces from the side of the frame. I make a mark and then cut one piece. With the piece I just cut, I use that as a template to ensure both pieces are exactly the same. While I'm there, I set my miter saw to cut at 45-degree angle. Remember, never use the setting on the saw itself. We need a tight and precise cut, so you need to make sure you use the proper gauge. Okay, everyone loves my tips and tricks. Let me show you how after cutting a perfect pair, I make sure the angles do not change the size of the board. I take my speed square and I place it on the edge of the board. Then I place the board upright so that the end of the piece and the end of the square are flush with the bench top. Then I make my corner mark. Using the light guide on the saw, I align the pencil mark and make my cuts. Both ends should be perfect after this. The back plate will be a thin piece of 1/4-inch birch plywood. We need to make the rabbet that the back plate will sit in before we join the frame together, so I lower the blade to just a fraction higher than the plywood. Next, I move my fence so I am taking a little more than half off the frame. Discount double check that you are making the rabbet on the correct side of the board. Do this by aligning all your pieces in the same orientation so you don't have to think about it when the saw is on. I'm going to treat this like I do all my shadow boxes. Yes, with my favorite router bit, the 3/8-inch roundover. If you don't know that by now, you haven't watched enough of my videos. Yes, my old bit was getting dull, so I upgraded my Craftsman to a new Diablo bit. This should get the job done. I am going to gradually increase the height, so this will take multiple passes. So let's move on so I don't bore you. Now we can begin to join our frame together. I am going to use wood glue and a few 18 gauge staples. While the glue is setting, I use a square to hold the piece in alignment. Keeping the box square is very important. A crooked box at this point would screw up your back plate and your racks. So take your time, keep it square, and allow it to set overnight. Find the center of your frame and place a mark. Then lay down your Spartan sword and trace some lines on either side of the blade. Remember when we took the measurement of the blade and it was 2 inches above the katana sheath and we added a ½ inch to the frame so it will be below the top? Well, now measure 2 inches up from the rabbet and make a mark on both sides of the frame. We are going to drill our holes for the blade to pass through the frame. Start with the top and drill out your holes. I attempted to cheat here and use a router bit in my drill press. It got the job done, but it was not as easy as I had hoped. First, notice the frame is not laying flat on the tabletop. Well, that's because the bottom of the frame sat on the shoe of the drill press. Raise the tabletop, you say? Then my arms will not clear the fence, so I just had to make do. I'm pretty sure I could have saved myself a lot of time if I had just done this with the cordless hand drill. But in my head, I just wanted to make sure the holes were perfectly up and down. Once you're done, you can check that the sword fits and then move on. Next, take your measurement for the back plate and then just take it to the table saw and cut it to fit. Okay, I don't have a piece of felt long enough to cover the entire box, so I will hide the seam under one of the racks. But first, I need to align the racks to the center of the box. I knew that I wanted the racks to be 14 inches apart when I laid them out my very first time during the display setting. So I will start with the center of the box and then measure out 7 inches in each direction. I will then trace a line on either side of each rack, and this will tell me where my seams can go. And it will also let me know where my pilot holes need to go so I can screw in the racks from the back of the box. Once you have your lines drawn, simply drill out at least 3 pilot holes for screws to go into the back of your racks. So just like I did for the shadow box with the shells and the model ships, I lay in my racks and with a pencil make a mark for the pilot holes. Remember to mark the back of your racks with a left and a right, since you are just eyeballing this and you want to make sure that your pilot holes align when you get ready to screw them in. Before you begin to stain, do a quick sanding with 320 grit sandpaper. You don't have to spend too much time on this. This should already be pretty smooth still. And then with a wet cloth, wipe it down, making sure you get all the excess sawdust. Then you can begin to stain. While the stain is drying, we can begin to felt the back plate. Lay down your first piece and make sure it covers at least to one of the rack lines we drew. Then trim it to fit. I am going to just use Gorilla Spray adhesive here and spray the board, then lay down the felt and allow it to dry. After the stain is dried, I simply rub on a coat of polyurethane using paper towels to give it that shiny look. After the poly is dried, nail down the back plate. We can simply nail it down since the box will contain no glass. Although I made marks for the pilot holes, I never got around to drilling them, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm just playing catch up. Make sure you have your right rack on the right and the left one on the left. If you did not mark these earlier, then you need to figure out which is which, or this part could be very difficult. Remember when we drilled our original holes through the back, we just eyeballed it. So you need to make sure you have the right racks in place so your pilot holes align on either side. Once you have them aligned, just screw in your racks. The very last step is to place some hanging brackets. I measure down 1 inch from the top of the box and make my pilot holes. I screw in my brackets. Make sure the pilot holes are in the frame and not just through the back plate. Check now that your screw will slide in and out easily. You don't want to have it too tight and then find that out while you're on a ladder trying to hold it in the air and it won't go in. Overall, a pretty easy build that looks great. Not bad for my first sword display. Would you have gone with a different layout? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know what you're thinking. As always, thanks for watching and hit that subscribe button.